In school, we learned about Rome and Greece and about kings and philosophers, castles and democracy, but I feel like when it came to Africa, the story was either silence, like nothing, we didn't hear about Africa much, or if we did talk about it, it was always in the context of something like slavery, or maybe how they came here and had to deal with civil rights. Maybe a passing image of something like exotic as well. Like it was never about civilizations that had power, trade, and knowledge of their own. And that's what I find like deeply ironic. While we memorized the Colosseum, our textbooks ignored like the pyramids of Sudan, the stone cities of Zimbabwe, the manuscripts of Mali, the bronzes of Benin. Africa wasn't a blank space. It was kingdoms, real powerful kingdoms. And today we're going to talk about the ones they never taught you in school. Welcome back to They Lied About Africa. I'm your host, Numba, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. In today's episode, we're continuing our Reclaiming the African Story series, where we explore the depth and brilliance of Africa's past, one chapter at a time. Now, over the next few minutes, we'll journey through 5 different African kingdoms from across the continent. You'll hear when and where they rose, what made them powerful, and just like details that bring them to life and the legacies they still leave us today. So I just want you guys to keep in mind that these stories are not just about the past. They are literally blueprints for understanding Africa's present and imagining its future. So let's start in Sudan, a place that almost never comes up in our textbooks unless it's in the context of like modern conflict, which is completely valid. But back in the ancient world, Sudan was home to a powerhouse called Kingdom of Kush. The Kushites ruled along the Nile for centuries, and when Egypt's big dynasty started fading, Kush stepped in. Their capital, Meroe, I hope I'm pronouncing these correctly, and if I'm not, I apologize, around 800 BCE to about 350 CE, became one of the most advanced cities of its time. And what I find so cool is like during this time, most of the world was still trying to figure out how to work iron like on a large scale, but they were actually basically an iron factory. Archaeologists even say that you can still find hills of old iron slag, which are like the leftovers of smelting. They're piled up around the ruins. That iron industry made them rich, powerful, and impossible to ignore in regional trade. Now, picture this. You're like traveling across the desert and suddenly you see pyramids, not the ones you're used to in Egypt, but smaller, steeper, and sharper pyramids. Over 200 of them scattered across the sand. These weren't built by pharaohs, but by the kings and queens of Kush. And yes, queens called Kandeks actually led armies and negotiated with the Romans. One Kandek queen went to war with Rome in the 1st century BCE. Roman historians describe how she fought fiercely, enough to force a peace treaty on equal terms. So much for the idea that women in the ancient world were always sidelined. And here's the nuance though. Kush wasn't just Egypt's cousin. They borrowed some Egyptian traditions like pyramid building and hieroglyphics, but they developed their own script called Meroitic, one of Africa's earliest alphabets. And to this day, nobody fully understands that. Imagine that. A whole written language that we still can't completely translate. So what is the legacy here? These pyramids still stand in the desert, even though most people have never heard of them. Meroe is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and in pop culture, the word Kadeke still shows up as a symbol of African female power. It's just a reminder that Sudan wasn't just a backdrop to Egypt's story. It was a center of innovation, trade, and resistance in its own right. Now, from the deserts and pyramids of Kush, let's head a little further east into the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea. Because when Kush eventually faded, another African powerhouse rose up, the kingdom of Aksum. Aksum thrived from around the 1st to the 7th century CE, and honestly, it was one of the great world empires of its time, but you'd never know it from a school textbook. While Rome was flexing in Europe and Persia was expanding in the Middle East, Aksum was controlling trade across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. And here's what made them stand out. They minted their own coins, gold, silver, bronze, stamped with their kings' names. That might sound normal today, but in antiquity, the power to issue currency meant you weren't just trading, you were calling the shots. Coins from Aksum have been found as far away as India, proof that African kingdoms were not isolated. They were plugged into global trade. And then there's King Izana. In the 4th century CE, he converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the very first states in the world, not just Africa, to adopt Christianity as an official religion. That's centuries before most of Europe. Imagine While Europeans were still practicing pagan traditions, Ethiopia already had churches carved out of rock and scriptures written in their own ancient language. But Aksum wasn't just about like trade and religion. Their monuments are literally insane. 100 feet tall, carved from single slabs of granite. They were basically skyscrapers of their time, making royal tombs. Even today, people in Ethiopia point to these monuments as part of their national pride. So here's the nuance when it comes to this kingdom. Aksum's power didn't last forever, right? There was climate change, shifting trade routes, and later Islamic expansion around the Red Sea, which eventually cut them off from global networks. But their cultural and religious legacy is massive. Ethiopia is still home to one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world, tracing back directly to Aksum. So while we memorize Rome's arches and Greece's temples, Aksum's coins and churches remind us that Africa was just as much as part of the ancient story, a superpower in its own right. Now, from the highlands of Ethiopia, we're going to move into the Sahel, the wide stretch of land just under the Sahara. So by the 1200s, one of Africa's most legendary empires was rising here, the Malian Empire. This is honestly one of my favorite empires to research about, to talk about. It's beautiful and it's amazing. So essentially, Mali controlled the gold and salt trade routes that connected West Africa to North Africa and beyond. And for the most part, over half of the world's gold supply in the medieval period came out of West Africa. That wealth turned Mali into a superpower, y'all. Now, we need to talk about somebody important. You probably heard the name Mansa Musa. He's often called the richest man in history, but the story usually stops there. Like, he was just some dude with money. Like, the truth is, he used that wealth strategically. In 1324, he made the famous pilgrimage to Mecca, traveling with a caravan so big it literally caused inflation in Cairo because he gave away so much gold. But more important than the flex was what he brought back: scholars, architects, and connections that turned Mali into a center of learning. At the heart of it was Timbuktu. And no, Timbuktu isn't just a funny word for middle of nowhere. It was basically the Harvard and Oxford of its time. The Sankore University and other madrasas held tens of thousands of manuscripts on math, medicine, astronomy, and law. People traveled from across Africa and the Middle East to study there. So imagine being told Africa had no written history, quote unquote, when Timbuktu's library still hold texts dating back hundreds of years. But there is nuance in this story and in this kingdom. Mali wasn't just a fairy tale golden empire. We gotta keep it a buck, okay? Internal conflicts and shift in trade routes eventually weakened it, and by the 1400s, power had passed to the Songhai Empire. So while Musa's wealth gets memeified, Mali's real achievement was building institutions of knowledge that lasted long after the gold caravan stopped. And today, manuscripts of Timbuktu are still being preserved, even smuggled to safety during recent conflicts in Mali. It's proof that Africa's legacy of learning wasn't destroyed. It's still here, waiting to be recognized. So we just talked about Timbuktu's manuscripts, Africa proving it had a written record of its own. But writing isn't the only way to preserve history. What if your history was literally cast in bronze? That's exactly what happened in the Kingdom of Benin. Located in what is today southern Nigeria, the Benin Kingdom flourished from the 1200s until the late 1800s. Its capital city was laid out with massive moats and walls, some of the largest earthworks in the pre-modern world. But what really sets Benin apart is its art. The royal court had entire guilds of metal workers who crafted thousands of plaques, statues, and masks, now known as the Benin Bronzes. These bronzes weren't just decoration, they were records. They showed the obas, the kings receiving ambassadors, riding into battle, or conducting ceremonies. Every piece was basically a historical Instagram feed in brass and ivory, which makes it even more frustrating that when our schools mentioned Benin at all, it was usually through the story of European explorers discovering it, not the fact that Benin was documenting its own story centuries before colonization. But here's the twist. In 1897, the British launched a punitive expedition against Benin. They burned the city and looted thousands of bronzes, shipping them to museums across Europe and America. So if you've ever seen a Benin plaque in the British Museum or in the Met in New York, now you know the backstory. Those weren't gifts. They were literally stolen. And yet the artistry is undeniable. The detail is so advanced that when Europeans first saw them, some historians refused to believe Africans could have made them. They tried to claim Benin must have learned from outsiders because the reality of African genius didn't fit their narrative. So today, the conversation has come full circle. Countries like Nigeria are demanding the return of the bronzes, and some institutions have started sending pieces back. That means Benin's story isn't just ancient history, it's living, it is political, especially political, and it's part of the fight to reclaim Africa's cultural heritage. So, we've seen how Benin's bronzes were taken and now being reclaimed. For our fifth and final kingdom, let's shift to a story where the ruins themselves still stand, undeniable, unmovable, and impossible to erase. Welcome to the Great Zimbabwe. From the 11th to the 15th century, this was the heart of a powerful Shona kingdom in southern Africa, and the ruins that remain, massive stone enclosures built without any mortar, are some of the most stunning monuments on the continent. Imagine walls over 30 feet high, curving into complex patterns, all pieced together like a giant puzzle. No cement, no glue, just precision stonework that's still standing 6 centuries later. Great Zimbabwe was rich off gold and cattle, linking Africa's interior to the Indian Ocean trade network. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain and Persian glass beads at the site, proof that this wasn't just some isolated community. It was plugged into global trade long before colonization. Now, here's where the myth busting comes in. When Europeans first saw these ruins in the 1800s, they literally refused to believe Africans could have built them. Some even tried to claim they were the lost city of Sheba or remnants of certain settlers, anything but the obvious, that Africans have engineered their own monumental city. That denial says more about colonial prejudice than about the ruins themselves. And the symbols of Great Zimbabwe still echo today. The infamous Zimbabwe bird carved in soapstone is on the national flag. The very name of the country, Zimbabwe, means house of stone. It's a direct reclaiming of that heritage. So as we wrap up these 5 kingdoms, think about the arc we've just traveled. From pyramids in Sudan to stele in Ethiopia, manuscripts in Mali, bronzes in Nigeria, and stone cities in Zimbabwe. Africa's history is everywhere, guys, like written in iron, art, gold, in libraries, and in stone. It was never a blank space. It was and is a continent of kingdoms. So we just talked about these 5 kingdoms, and honestly, there's only one more thing to say that is worth saying, and that I think we've all have a general consensus of, and that is Africa has always been a continent of builders and thinkers and innovators. And the truth is that the reason we weren't taught this wasn't an accident. Erasing these stories made it so much easier to reduce Africa to being primitive, having to only do with slavery, poverty, or something like exotic. But the pyramids, the stele, the manuscripts, the bronzes, the stone walls, they prove otherwise. Reclaiming the story is more than just history. It's resistance. It's healing. It's about knowing that the same continent they taught us was empty was running global trade routes, funding libraries, carving monuments, and casting its own history in bronze. So here's what I want you to do. Don't just listen, share. Share this with someone who still thinks Africa had no history before slavery. Start some sort of a conversation. Let these stories breathe outside of the classroom. If you want to see the visuals and dive deeper into the sources, check out my link tree. You'll find them all there in the show notes or in the description box if you're watching via YouTube. And for more daily content, follow me on Instagram and TikTok at They Lied About Africa. That's where I post clips, carousels, and conversations that keep this history alive and connected to our present. Well, that is all I have for y'all today. This was They Lied About Africa. I'm Numbe. Until next time, keep reclaiming, keep questioning, and keep remembering Africa was never a blank space. It was and is a story worth fighting for.